Hey everybody, welcome to Drive Thru Review 649. Today we're going to talk about Crusaders. This is a new game coming out from Tasty Minstrel Games, designed by Seth Jaffe. And to kind of give you a little bit of a short history of this, and as far as my understanding of the game goes, about 5 or 6 years ago, a game came out from Stefan Feld called Trajan, and it has this kind of like Moncala thing where you pick up these sort of cubes or stones, different colored stones, and you move around your board and take different actions where you drop them. Now, I had spoken with Seth way back when, and I remember him saying to me, he says, okay, when he first heard about the Moncala in Trajan, he had a very different immediate understanding of what that might be. And then once, the information about the game came out and all that stuff, he was like, that's kind of the opposite of how I would do it. And so it kind of planted a germ and a seed in him to kind of come up with his own sort of take on that. So if you're familiar with Trajan, the initial kind of mechanic in here is going to seem very familiar in a way, but it plays out kind of in a completely different way and has a completely different theme and so on. So let's go ahead and jump in and tell you how the game works, and then I'll come back and tell you my thoughts. So there's kind of two main parts of the game. Here is the main player board where players will be moving their knights around and sort of taking over and building buildings in these different locations. This is sort of a fictionalized version of Europe. The board's actually double-sided. This is the 2-player side. On the other side, you have the 3 and the 4-player side. And then here we have an example of a player board. You can see a couple of different things here. You've got this sort of wheel here, and these are the different actions that you're going to take. And each player has a similar set of these wedges. Now, one player is going to randomly determine how these are set up, and then every other player is going to look at their board and then copy them. And so you can see close up here, you have, let's say, a travel action. And on the back side, it tells you down here, if you flip it over, you also have the crusade action. So over the course of the game, you might upgrade this to be able to do a travel and a crusade on that wedge. And I'll explain that in a minute. So you have this sort of wheel of wedges here, and then you have these different buildings here, which as you build them, will start to unlock special abilities and score you extra points and things. You have these knights up here, which will help you do raids and things. And then before you start the game, you're going to get a choice of one of 2 of these different kind of houses. Now there's a giant stack here, so you're randomly going to get 2 out of that stack and choose one, and this is going to dictate to you a couple of things. You can see here this says an 11 and this says a 10. Normally the basic way is you start with 12 of these little pawns here, 2 on each of these, but in this case I just drew these randomly. You're actually going to start with 1 or 2 less, but you can also see you get an ability. So this one here says once per turn, when distributing action tokens, you may skip a wedge. That'll make more sense in a minute. Or this one is once per turn, when distributing action tokens, you may place 2 on the same wedge. And there's a whole variety of these. So let's just do this one here. We'll choose that, and then we're going to pull one off. Sometimes they may even have you add extra and so on, so you may start with more than 12. So each player will pick one of those to start the game. And then your turn is made up of basically 2 things. One is either upgrading a wedge. So if I wanted to upgrade that for my turn, I could take these off, flip it up, and then I'll put these back on here. And then I can redistribute any of the tokens on here that I want. So maybe I would go, I'll choose this one. So you'll pick these up and then sort of daisy chain and drip those along. So you start to build up more and more of these. Now the other thing that you're going to do more of is actually pick one of these wedges and do the action of that. So very simply, let's say we chose here travel. You can see we've got 1 pawn on there. We're going to choose the travel action. We're going to pick up all of them. In this case, there's only 1, and start to trickle them along. And so that will move off to there. So now we can do the travel action for a power of 1. Whereas over here, we have the muster action. If we wanted to do that, we would pick up all of these, and we basically have effectively 3 strength in that particular action. And then we'll daisy chain these along on for that. And then on our next turn, maybe we'll gather some influence. And you can see we've built up now 4 on this. So we've made this a little bit more powerful. So there's a lot of planning and stuff that goes on, like, I might do this here. That's going to build up this action here. And if I do that later, I can move this around. But then sometimes you get the upgrade action here. So you've got travel and build. So if I pick this up, I could do one or both. So I could spend 2 in build and 1 in travel. And then so you'd have that. And then as you unlock buildings, you can see, for example, here, see this little build icon, which matches that icon there. So if I did this, I could pick up these group here of 3, spend 1 on the build and 2 on the travel, because you always got to at least spend 1. But because I've unlocked these buildings, I actually have 3 build and 2 travel. So there you go. So you can start to sort of mangle with all of these different actions through upgrading buildings, and it gets more and more interesting as the game moves along. So let's talk about what each of the different actions actually does. So the first thing we'll talk about is travel, and as you guessed it, you can actually travel. And that's very simply spending 1 point of travel to move 1 space. However, if you try to move out of a space that has enemy tokens on the board, that's actually going to cost you 2 points of travel to move out of that particular spot. Now let's take a closer look at the board here. You can see we've seeded a little bit of the tokens on the board here. You're going to randomly seed out tokens from 3 various kind of, let's call them NPC factions. And you're also going to have various spots on the board here that are going to show you what kind of building bonuses and kind of special abilities based on certain buildings are going to happen on the board. And these are all randomly dealt out at the start of the game. But back to travel, you're basically trying to move your knights in and conquer territories and sort of beat back these tokens from the enemy factions. And then once you do so, then hopefully start to build your own buildings out onto the board. Now the next action we could talk about is build. So once you move into an area that has an empty square or has been cleared of the enemy factions, and to open up the square, you can start to build the buildings from your player board onto the board like so. So let's just take a look at a couple of the rows here. First, you can see the cost to build, and that's the number of the tokens that you have to have spent, or the power that you have to build that. So I need 3 build to build this first temple here. But again, remember, once I build that and start to put these on the board, this is going to give me kind of like an automatic bonus to my build action. Whereas let's say I built these little farms up here, these also have a cost of 3 and then 4 for the second one. These will give you a bonus to the muster action, which we'll talk about in a minute. And it's also worth knowing when you do this, a lot of times you'll do these actions with these little banners on it. You're going to get that amount of influence from the bank. And there's a certain setup number of influence that acts as kind of a timer. I've just set up a pile of all of it here, but based on the number of players, you're going to have a certain amount that's in here. And then once that runs out, that's one of the triggers for the end of the game. Then you finish out the round and everybody will keep playing until everybody has an even number of turns. So and then you've got the other types of buildings here. These have your churches here. These are going to help you with the influence action, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then you have, somewhat importantly here, these castles. So as you build these, this one's not going to do anything, but it's going to unlock here this new knight. You're going to then put that knight out onto the spot where you put the castle. And when you spend move, you can now move any knights that you have on the board, the one that you started with, or if you get all the way up to here, then you can unlock your 3rd knight, like so. But then you can unlock different things. We can add extra travel and extra raid and so, or crusade and so on. So that's the gist of the build action. The next thing we might take a look at here, we see we've unlocked some influence tokens here. When you take an influence action, you're going to look over here. Let's just plop over there. Let's say we've got these 4 here. We're going to get 4 points in influence and maybe plus 5 and then 6. So we've got 6 influence for unlocking that. And you're just simply going to collect that much influence from the bank. And you'll kind of find throughout the game as you do some of the more sort of mechanically useful actions, the tokens are just kind of pile up on this influence marker, and it's kind of like letting out the gas or opening a valve and then releasing all those tokens back around the side of the board there. Next thing we'll talk about is the muster action. And you can see here again the cost in muster points, which is again the pawns on the muster wedge, to upgrade the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 5th one. So here it costs you 3. You'll get 1 victory point, because remember the banners will tell you the victory points you get, or the influence points I should say. Then you'll flip this over, and you'll see here, as you flip these over, these have little icons in there which will help you with the crusades. So it'll give you bonuses to doing the crusade action over on your wedge. So let's talk about that. So let's say we've moved into an enemy territory. In this case, we've moved into the Prussian territory. We might have moved into the Saracen territory, and there's also here tokens for the Slavs. And so when you go into fight, you're going to fight them at a certain amount of strength. And you need to match that strength or beat it, again, with the tokens here from your wedges plus any bonuses when you do the crusade action. Now up at the top of the board here, you can see the Saracens always are strength of 6, and the other 2 factions have kind of an increasing strength. So if you look here at the Prussians, they started a strength of 3, but every time you fight them, you're going to then upgrade that. So the strength is going to get harder for everybody over the course of the game. And if we kind of plop down here, the Slavs also have that similar idea. They start at 3 and they start moving up as people fight them. Now normally when you fight here the Slavs or the Prussians, you're going to fight them, you're going to take their token off of the board, keep that for yourself. So you're going to start to want to collect a variety of the different tokens because there's some end-game points to collecting all of these, which I'll talk about in a minute. But then you're also going to collect victory points or influence points equal to the strength of where they were at. However, the Saracens are a little different. The Saracens here, you're going to flip over and they're going to give you a bonus. Like this one is going to let you build a free farm. And this one here, let's take a look at that one. This one will let you build a free church. This one here will let you build a castle. This one will allow you to do a free muster. If you don't want to do that, then you can just get 3 straight influence out of the bank. But it is worth noting that if you do one of these building ones, you have to build it in the spot where you fought them. And then of course you'll collect, the token for in-game scoring as well. So let's talk about the in-game scoring. Well, the first thing we're going to look at are the scoring bonuses for the 3 different factions. Now, whoever has the most in a particular faction will get this tile, and this is worth 5 in all cases. But I have this handy thing, so if there's a tie, you'll flip that up, and then it says everybody gets 3 points. And then at the bottom it says then second place, if you can focus on that, is not awarded in that case. But let's say you get, so there's a clear winner, they get 5, and then second place here will get 2. But let's say there's a tie for second, and then you flip that over and everybody gets 1. So this is a handy way instead of trying to divide things up. And it works the same way for each of the 3 factions like that. And then if we look at all of these level 4 buildings, you can see these will all have end-game bonus points. This top one here is if you have a set of each different type of faction, you're going to get 4 points there. This is just a straight 6 points. This is 1 point for each knight that you have on the board, plus the upgraded Crusaders there. And then this last one here is 4 points for each level 4 building that you have built onto the board. And that's pretty much the gist of the game. There's a couple of different variants for different setups and learning games and all kinds of ways to kind of randomize the board and everything in different ways. Okay, so that is a Crusader. So let's jump into the 3 pillars of reviewing. First is playtime. The box says 45 to 60 minutes. I would say that's probably right after your first game. It takes a little bit to kind of get used to what you're supposed to do because there is a lot of planning ahead that you want to do because you pick pawns up from one wedge, drop them in another, then you built this up and you're like, well, should I strike now and use this one that has a few more tokens on it or do something else and really build that one up and that kind of stuff. And then you get kind of used to it and you get used to the race and you start to see where other people are going and what territories they're going after, what types of factions they're interacting with and what kind of buildings they're getting out, all that kind of stuff. So then the game will pick up. So I'd say once you play it once or twice, you probably get into that hour mark, even at the 4-player count, which leads us to player count. And I would say I like this more with more than 2, but I still like it with 2. It's a little bit kind of zero sum, with 2, it's like, well, okay, you're over there and I'm over here, so I'll do this and you do that. Whereas, the board grows with more players, but it just feels like there's more sort of, watching your back at the beginning of the game. Whereas in the 2-player game, you just have like the 2 knights out there. So once somebody goes that way, I can go the other way. Whereas in 3-player or 4-player, it's like, okay, Billy goes that way, and then Francesca might go that way with him, or she might come this way, and I was planning on going this way. So this is a little bit more interaction, and it feels a little bit more tense, and the race part of it is more tense with more players. So I like it with more, but I still like it with 2 because there's still enough going on to kind of crunch on in terms of the wheel and stuff like that, which will lead me into the stuff that this reminds me of. What games does this remind me of? And it kind of reminds me of Trajan, obviously because of the pawns dropping around and the whole Mancala thing. But it feels very different. It's more of a, well, Trajan's kind of a race too, but it's more of a race. It's more of a pure race, I guess you could say, than Trajan. But it also feels like more of a deck builder than Trajan does because you've got the whole upgrade thing. You've got the whole idea of not just like figuring out when to upgrade, but when to pull the trigger on that large wedge. And one of the things that sort of bugs me about the game, but I'm too stupid to figure out a better way of doing this, is the influence thing. When you take an action and get influence. And you're like, I was avoiding that because I'd rather do other things that's going to allow me to get tokens and get buildings out, which are going to make my actions in the future even better. Then I'm like, oh, I pull the trigger. There's like 8 of them on influence, and then I trickle them around. And then it gets kind of fiddly because you're picking up 8 and trying to figure out, so you don't drop them and knock stuff over. That's the only thing that kind of really bothers me about that. But in that way, it feels like a deck builder where you have that kind of release valve thing where it's like, okay, I'm building the deck, building the deck, building the deck, and then I've got to like turn and burn and get points and stuff going this way. And that's just like a minor sort of arc inside the loop of the wedge. But then there's kind of like that larger game loop where you're then trying to get up to where you've got a lot of like extra build points, you've got a lot of extra muster points. So maybe you're just cruising around killing a bunch of stuff, or you're getting a lot of buildings out and you're going for one of those 4-point bonuses. So that larger loop is pretty satisfying. I like that part of it. So there's enough of that kind of stuff going on that you're sort of trying to manage all those different wheels spinning, the little wheels within the big wheels kind of thing, that the 2-player game's still interesting, but it's still, I think it's better with more players. Yeah, so I think the thing that kind of like, I don't want to say saves it for me, because when the first time I played it, I was like, this is good. I like this. But I'm not real sure about like how good it is. Like it's solid and it's put together. I can tell it was, I think I can tell. Sometimes it's hard to tell. I assume it was play tested and developed well. It feels like it. The thing that kind of brought me back to it, I'm like, okay, this is a good game. And this is a really good game because the random setup. You randomize and put out different faction tokens. You're not going to use all of them in the game. And you have more or less of certain factions out there. And how they're kind of like front loaded as well, because you may have like a bunch of the Saracen ones right in front and those give you like the extra buildings. Well, the next game, you may not have as many of those and they may be kind of like scattered and buried all over the place. And those have like a fixed attack value of 6. So you can know that you can get to that, but sometimes the other ones will be in front and then you've got to, kind of be more cognizant of your crusading and your mustering, because as folks do combat with them, those are going to bump all the way up to like 8, 9, 10. And so the way that sort of path evolves on the board is going to be different from game to game. So the games are going to actually feel a little bit different each time you play them. And the little building bonuses and stuff, which I kind of just glossed over, to give you easier paths to build certain buildings, or give you bonus points for building certain buildings in the different areas. That's going to change up a little bit. So that might kind of, to me, that part feels like it kind of wedges you into the beginning of the game. Like, well, I get a bonus for this, it's cheaper, so I'll do this. And that kind of just gets you going on a path. It doesn't make you go down on a path, because I've seen other players build buildings where they don't get a bonus in that particular spot because they're like, well, I really want to unlock this extra thing or get this unlocked to level 4. So I want to, force in on that. But that's kind of cool because it gives you kind of a little bit of an interesting kick in the butt at the beginning to like just go, well, I'm getting a bonus for this. I don't really know what my strategy is yet because things are just starting out. So it gets you kind of going along that way. So yeah, I think that's pretty much the game. Like I said, the replayability is really nice because everything is just randomized at the beginning. You've got all those random starter abilities, which is also a thing I kind of glossed over. I should probably talk about more, but there's just a bunch of those. Like sometimes you get extra, there's like a black knight, so you get an extra knight at the beginning. Or sometimes you'll start off with more tokens, but like your travel action is really hindered and you always travel at -1 and you're like, whoa, that's terrible. But you get a bunch of extra tokens on your wedge too, which is going to add up over the course of the game. So there's a lot of interesting variability there as well. So I definitely recommend folks take a look at it. The only other thing that sort of bugs me about the game is the title, because it's Crusaders and it's really more about the Knights Templar, and they're not doing any crusading anywhere, which is probably a good thing. But they're just kind of like taking over Europe and sort of these independent houses and factions setting up different power bases and stuff. It's like influence, in Europe. And so I feel like it should have just been called Templars or something, but I don't know why it's called Crusaders, because they're not going to the Holy Land or anything. So that's kind of weird, but I don't really think about that when I'm playing the game. I just think about optimizing my engine and getting a bunch of points. Other than that kind of weird thing, I really enjoy this game. I definitely recommend it to folks that if you really like Trajan, which I love Trajan, I think this is worth experiencing a couple of times because it's got the same thing. Like I mentioned at the beginning, the designer told me way back when, he's like, yeah, I really wanted Trajan to be like this, but then it was like this. And I played it and I was like, oh, this is actually pretty good, but I want to do a game like this. And that's cool. I think that's really neat because you don't really see Moncala games. I can't really think of anyone that's a real kind of Moncala like this and Trajan. There's probably one or two others that I'm not remembering. But it's a very different, quicker kind of experience. If I could compare it to Trajan real quick before shutting up. It's a very snappy turn. Whereas Trajan, there's a little bit of AP, I think, when you first play this, but after a while, it's very much a race and kind of a deck building, engine building kind of thing. But then it's very snappy. I'll build here, do this, I'm going to build that building. It cost me 5, but it's just build a building. Or I'm going to travel this many spaces, or muster this guy, and that's just cost me 4. It doesn't cost, I don't have to do anything extra, it's just a higher cost. So the turns go very, very snappy. So definitely take a look at this one, and that is Crusaders. Thanks.